Hi everybody, Kurt here from AstroQuest 1. So I've been asked about buying a new telescope, what telescope should I get, and so I figured I'd make a little video and show my stuff off all at the same time. So that's what this thing's all about. Before I get started, there's a lot of good videos out there on buying a telescope. You should check the date on them because things do, not things change all that much, but they do change a little bit. In fact, Celestron just came out with a new StarSense telescope, and it's fabulous. You can use your cell phone with it, and it's really good for beginners as well. CJ from Rosewell Astronomy just did a recent video on it, and I'll post the link right here, as well as put it in the description section. Another good video that I came across was done by Wido Oerlemans from Astroforum. Here's the link. And his video just more or less concentrates on astrophotography. My video is for general astronomy, a little bit of astrophotography, but mainly just towards any type of astronomy. Anyways, before we get started with that, let me give you the Reader's Digest version into telescopes. Okay, Reader's Digest telescopes. So I'm going to stay kind of hunched over on this so you can see me. Anyways, the first type of telescope that was developed was a refractor telescope done by Hans Lippershey back in 1608. And in this type of telescope, you have a lens, also known as an objective, and that concentrates the light. The light comes in straight, hits this lens, and it gets refracted down into a central point, and that point is called your focal point, and that's where your eyepiece goes, or your camera sensor if you're doing astrophotography. So what else can we say about this? Well, there's another thing called the focal length. The focal length is another number you might see when you're buying a telescope. That's the distance from your objective to the eyepiece. Another term you might hear of is aperture. Aperture is the thickness or the diameter of your objective. That's known as your aperture. And a fourth thing you might hear of all the time when you're buying a telescope is this thing known as your F ratio. The F ratio is basically the focal length divided by the aperture. So let's say you have, now what is that, how does that help us? If you have two telescopes both having the same aperture, let's say 80 millimeters, one is f5 and one is f7.5, well, the one that is f5 would have a focal length of 400 nanometers. The one that is f7.5 would have a focal length of 600 millimeters. And what happens is the one with the 7.5, f7.5, if you're doing visual astronomy, that field of view is going to be more narrow, but the magnification is going to be greater, so you'll have a better magnification. Now, when you're doing astrophotography, generally you might want a lower F ratio because you don't have to image as long on an object. You can do shorter exposures, but that's another story. I don't want to get into that right now. So that's for all scopes, not just the refractors. The F ratio, focal length, and focal point. Those are for all the types. What are some advantages of a refractor type telescope? Well, they're pretty durable, and they're pretty much maintenance free. All you have to do is clean the lens every once in a great while. Other than that, they're good to go right out of the box, by golly, and they're good overall. I mean, they're good for all types of imaging. They're good for planets, they're good for deep sky objects, they're good for anything, globular clusters, so they're a good all-around scope. What are some disadvantages? Well, all refractors suffer from chromatic aberration, and chromatic aberration is when the red, the green, the blue, the colors, when they go through the lens, they get separated and they don't all meet at exactly the same focal point. And I'll show you a little picture right now of what that looks like. Okay, so that's what chromatic aberration is. Now, you can correct that with more glass, with more lens. So like, if the lens is made up of two pieces of glass, that's called the doublet, and that'll correct some of that chromatic aberration that I was talking about. You can actually put three pieces of glass. Your lens would be made of three different pieces, and that'll virtually eliminate the chromatic aberration. The other disadvantage is they tend to be more expensive as the aperture gets bigger, and that price goes up exponentially. It's really incredible how expensive they get, just going from one size to another. So that's the refractor. Okay, the second type of telescope that I want to talk about is a Newtonian reflector, 1668, by none other than Sir Isaac Newton. And in this case, the light rays come in, and it's an open tube, and they come all the way back and hit a mirror rather than a lens. So they call that the primary mirror. So that's your objective, and then that reflects the light back up the column. Near the opening, there's a secondary mirror that's angled, and that reflects the light rays up to the eyepiece or your camera lens. That's your focal point. Now, these telescopes are quite interesting. What are some advantages of the Newtonian reflector? Well, one is, since it's a mirror, it doesn't suffer from that chromatic aberration that the lenses do, so it takes care of that. You don't have to worry about that. Another advantage is the mirrors are cheap compared to lenses, so you can get a great big diameter aperture Newtonian reflector for a really reasonable price. So more bang for your buck with this Newtonian reflector. What's a disadvantage? Well, one of the disadvantages of these things is, as I said, the refractor is pretty much self-sufficient. It's maintenance-free. This thing, you got to tweak it every time you use it. You have to what's known as culminate it. So, but it's not really that hard to culminate it. It's quite easy to do. But otherwise, these are great scopes, these Newtonian reflectors. Okay, the third type of telescope is a Cassegrain reflector, and this was developed in 1672 by Laurent Cassegrain. Now, in this type of scope, the light rays come straight in, like they do the Newtonian reflector, but there's actually a piece of glass right here. Anyways, the light rays come in, they come all the way back, and again, they hit the mirror in the back, just like they do with the Newtonian, and that's your primary mirror. But in this case, the light gets reflected back, but that secondary mirror is actually mounted to that glass plate. And then it reflects it all the way back down the column again to your focal point, and that's where your eyepiece or camera sensor is. So they do have different types of Cassegrain reflectors. There's the Ritchie Christian, that was developed in 1910. This is the type that the Hubble Space Telescope is Ritchie Christian, or RC. There's the Rowe Ackerman Schmidt astrograph that was developed in 1930. There's a Schmidt Cassegrain telescope developed in 1940, and the Maksutov Cassegrain developed in 1941. The RC and the RASA, those are both just for astrophotography, so they're not for visual use. These two are both visual and astrophotography. What are some advantages and disadvantages of this thing? Well, this thing, they're more compact, so that's kind of good. And they're a quasi between reflector, refractor. If you think about it, they're ounce for ounce, they're less expensive than a reflector would be for the same aperture, but they're more expensive than the Newtonian reflector. They don't have as much maintenance as the refractor, but they do have some. They're not as much as the reflector. You don't have to tweak it every time, but there is some tweaking. So these scopes have their advantages as well. They're sort of, like I said, they're quasi between the refractor reflector. Okay, so that's it with the different types of telescopes. So these are the three main types, and I've got representations of all of them here, so I buy a lot of telescopes. Anyways, let's go take a look at what I've got. Okay, the first scope that I purchased myself ever was this little thing here. Isn't this cute? It's a little Newtonian reflector. It's called the Fun Scope, and it's a 76 millimeter aperture and 300 millimeter focal length. It's actually, I can highly recommend this. The reason I can recommend this is it's really cheap. It's like 50 bucks, 60 bucks maybe, but it's so compact. If I want to go outside and if I see something in the sky, I want to go look at it real quickly, I can get this out in like 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes, and I'm starting to look at stuff. It's that simple. You can set it up on your picnic table. I did put a little photographic thing, so I can put this on a stand as well, but I just put it on a picnic table. I just used it the other night. And the good thing about this little fun scope is it's got a 1 1/4 inch eyepiece holder. Now that 1 1/4 eyepiece holder is standard for this cheapo thing, as well as some of the top of the line stuff, some of my better scopes too. So you can use, what you can do with this thing is you can buy this cheapo little telescope, and if you like it, you can start buying better eyepieces, really good eyepieces to stick on here, and you'll see big differences. And then if you graduate to another telescope, you're not wasting your money because you still got the good eyepieces. One of the worst things you can do is buy those telescopes from a department store. Don't do it. Those are nothing but toys, and they come with like 1 1/4 inch, or no, they come with 0.096 inch eyepieces, which nobody makes eyepieces that fit those things, and the optics are really poor. And generally, they say it has great magnification. If anybody starts talking about magnification, magnification is probably the least important thing you got to worry about. Remember, I was talking about the aperture. So the aperture tells you how much light a telescope can capture, and actually that's what it's really all about, the light gathering ability. So this thing, small little thing, has decent light gathering ability for for what it is, and you can buy good eyepieces for it if you graduate to another telescope. Okay, next, turn me around. Okay, the second telescope I ever bought, I went from that to this thing. This is another Newtonian reflector. It's 203 millimeter diameter, and it's 1000 millimeter focal length. It's f4.9, and it's a really good scope. It was sat for a while, for about a couple of years, collecting dust. And the reason is I bought this not only for visual, but I bought it for astrophotography. And the problem was, it was not the telescope was not good. It was the mount that I bought it with. I bought it with the Cirrus mount. And this telescope on the Cirrus mount is good for just visual stuff. You want to look around. But for astrophotography, that mount wasn't good for handling this size scope. So that's why it was sort of a mistake, and it sat around collecting dust. And I knew the scope was unhappy. It was making whining noises, so I decided to do something about it. So what I did is I built a special type of mount. It's called a Dobsonian mount. Now, this is something I highly recommend for beginners, anybody actually. And that is to get a Dobsonian mounted thing, because they are so easy. They're just like that fun scope that I had. If you want to go out and look at something for like 5 minutes, you don't want to be out all night, you just want to go out and just really quickly look at something, you can do that with this type of scope, because there's no aligning or anything. You just bring it out and start and move it and point it towards wherever the star is, and that's it. And you're looking, or planet, or the moon, or whatever. So I highly recommend Dobsonians. The other thing about Dobsonians, usually, they're very they can get a very big scope on a Dobsonian mount. Now, I made this Dobsonian mount. Let me show it to you real quickly. There we go. I made this, but you can get them already pre-made, and they're pretty reasonably priced, because they're the Newtonian type reflector stuck in this Dobsonian mount. And now it's happy, because I use this thing quite a lot now. So, anyways. So, what did I get in place of the reflector? Well, I got this thing. This was my first telescope I got for astrophotography, and it's the Orion ED80 f7.5. So that means from the aperture, from the objective to the focal point, it's 600 millimeters. So this is a really good scope. I couldn't have been happier with it, and it fit that Orion, the Cirrus mount, really well. I did replace the focuser on it. The focuser was wasn't too fancy, and it was only single speed. So I replaced it with a Moonlight dual speed focuser. So this scope was about $500, and I replaced it The focuser was actually almost 300, so it was almost the price of the scope. But it turned out that I had this for years, and it was a trusty, rusty scope. Okay, let's go take a look at my next scope. Okay, my next scope was an Orion ST80, a short tube 80. And I actually purchased this scope to go on top of my ED80. This was my first scope I used for an auto guiding. When you do astrophotography, you have the main telescope you do imaging with, but you also have this other thing called an auto guider. And that's what this tube was for. However, I actually have a different auto guider now, and now I use this thing. I used it for terrestrial stuff. I used it to take pictures of the moon, in particular the eclipse we had in 2017. I replaced the original focuser and got a different focuser. This was a cheaper focuser, this replacement. I think it was about $120. But this scope is a really good scope. This is another one I can recommend for a first scope. So for first scopes, I recommend that fun scope that I was talking about, or that that big refractor on a Dobsonian mount would be a good first scope, or this thing. This thing is about 120 bucks right now, and if for 150 bucks or 170 bucks, you can actually get a little stand that goes along with it. This one was made by Orion. I'm not sure if Orion still has these, but I think Meade makes these telescopes, and a really good deal for it. You get some pretty good, nice wide field views. This is a f5, and it's a 400 millimeter focal length, 80 millimeter aperture. Okay, let's take a look at the next scope that I have. Okay, this is a Newtonian reflector. It's a 113 millimeter aperture, and the focal length on it is 450 millimeters. So this is f3.9. Now this is not, technically it's not my scope, but I was responsible for buying it. It was my school's telescope that I got for my astronomy class. I had this great idea that they would be using it and setting it up and all this stuff, and it didn't quite go the way I had it planned. But I still use it for tutorial methods, for tutorial stuff, but it just wasn't what I had in mind. This scope generally gets a bad rap because people often laugh at it, and it's not really the scope's fault. It's kind of ironic. It's actually a decent scope, but usually these companies, these astronomy companies, you know, Orion, not just Orion, all these companies, I think Celestron does it too, they sell this scope and they usually put it on a rickety old equatorial mount. And if you're beginning, I don't recommend getting an equatorial mount because you're going to be fumbling around with stuff, and you've got to polar align it before you even start observing, and then you move there's 4 things you got to turn before you get it to orient it quite the right way, and it's not good for beginners. Usually people that buy something like this, they'll try it out once, they'll go ooh and ah, and then they'll throw it in the closet and they won't use it again. Like I said, those Dobsonian mounted reflectors, the fun scope, or even even the refractor, they usually have what's called an alt-az mount. Those I recommend for first scopes because they're real easy. You can go out and look at something real quickly. These things are not that easy. But the scope itself is okay, but it's kind of funny. I don't know anybody that has one of these things or uses one. And if you are a person that has this scope, let me know. Put it down in the comments. I'd be really interested in what you think of it, because I don't, you know, I know a lot of astrophotographers, and nobody uses this thing for astrophotography, and nor do I have ever seen one really anybody using for observing either. So it's kind of interesting. So somebody must use them because they do sell these things, but I don't know anybody that has one. I just bought one for tutorial methods, but anyways, let's move on to my next scope. Okay, this next scope, this is also one that I purchased for work, and this is a Maksutov Cassegrain type. So this is my only Cassegrain type telescope. This is a really good scope. I can recommend this one too. I've actually, it's a 90 millimeter aperture. for the focal length, it's 1250 millimeters, which is larger than anything else I have. It's huge. It's because the light rays go in, up, and back again. Remember I was talking about that? So it's got a really large focal length, which means it has a really high F value. The F value for this thing is 13.9. So I've actually seen the Ring Nebula really well with this scope. The Ring Nebula is a tiny little nebula in Lyra, and it came out really well in this scope. So what's the good thing about these scopes? It has a really small field of view, but you get good magnification. It's really hard to find objects with this thing. This actually came with a go-to mount and a mechanical mount where you turn on, you have to do some aligning and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the one that came with it, it was an older model, and I don't even own it anymore. I tossed it. It kept breaking. What happened was when it turned, it kept breaking the wire, jamming the wire and splicing the wire off. I checked with the latest model that came with this scope, and they've actually changed the design on it so it doesn't do that anymore. But so that was a problem from Orion when they first sold this thing. But this is a good scope. You can get some good views. You can use this for terrestrial thing like bird watching too, like you can with the refractor. Reflectors, you really can't use it for terrestrial stuff because everything's upside down and whatnot. But this thing you can. This is about $250, $300, this particular telescope, and you'd probably want to get a mount with that. So you'd be looking around $400 or $500 to get this set up. So anyways, let's see what else we have. Okay, my last scope that I own or was responsible for buying is this thing. This is the Astrotech 115 aperture, and it's got a focal length of 805 millimeters. So it's a refractor, and I've been incredibly happy with this thing. I wouldn't recommend it for a beginner scope. It's really not. It's such a large aperture, and you'd probably want to get something else other than this to start off with. But it is a good scope if you want to get a second, third scope if you like this type of thing. You might notice that I'm partial towards refractors. I really like refractors. Although I could see getting some type of a Cassegrain in the future for doing astrophotography. But I'd highly recommend this scope, but mainly for a second scope or a third scope or whatever. In my case, it was my 7th scope. I hope you enjoyed this. I always kind of wanted to show off all my scopes before, and thought this would be a good opportunity to do that, and maybe be a tutorial to some people. Hi everyone. Sorry this never-ending video here. But I just want to make a point here. When you're buying a scope, make sure you look what's included in with it. For example, this telescope right here, it came with the rings, it came with a dual speed focuser, it came with a lot of stuff that's really important. It came with a diagonal. This scope, when I bought this one, all it was the OTA. This is my Orion ED80, and it didn't even come with the mounting rings. So all you got was the telescope, and that was it. So be careful of what you what's included when you purchase your scope. Most beginning telescope, they come in as a kit, so you don't have to worry about it. But I just thought I wanted to put that in there. I've attached a guide of all the scopes I talked about and what's included with the price at the end of this video. Okay, we'll see you later.